Frank stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the lapels of his new suit. It was a navy blue, tailored to perfection, with a crisp white shirt and a tie that matched the deep hue of his jacket. As he gazed at his reflection, he couldn't help but smile, a mix of pride and nerves swirling in his chest. Today was the day he had been waiting for, the start of a new chapter after months of uncertainty. The sun was barely up, casting a golden glow through the window as he grabbed his briefcase, mentally rehearsing the introduction he'd practiced the night before. The walk to the office was a blur of excitement and anticipation. Frank's thoughts danced between his hopes for this new job and the fresh start it represented. The city was alive with its usual morning hustle, but today it felt different to him, brighter, more promising. Every step brought him closer to the towering glass building where his new career awaited. He imagined shaking hands with his new colleagues, making that crucial first impression that could set the tone for his entire future at the company. His heart raced, but it was a good kind of nervousness, the kind that made him feel alive. As he approached the company's headquarters, the grandeur of the building didn't intimidate him as much as it had during his interview. Today, it felt like a symbol of his hard-earned success. He remembered the countless rejections and interviews that had led him here, the nights spent doubting if he'd ever find his place again in the corporate world. But those doubts were behind him now. With each stride, he felt a growing sense of confidence, as if the universe itself was aligning to ensure his success. Frank's mind began to wander, daydreaming about the future. He could see himself excelling in his role, gaining the respect of his peers, maybe even getting a promotion one day. He imagined the look on his wife's face when he'd tell her about his accomplishments, the pride in his son's eyes. It was these thoughts that carried him through the bustling streets, oblivious to the world around him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. But with each step closer to the office, a twinge of anxiety started to creep in. What if things didn't go as planned? What if this first day wasn't the fresh start he had hoped for? He pushed these thoughts aside, focusing instead on the positive. After all, he had prepared for this moment meticulously. He had the skills, the experience, and now, the opportunity. All he needed to do was show up and let his work speak for itself. As the office building loomed in the distance, Frank's pace quickened. He was eager to get inside, to begin this new journey. The familiar hum of the city traffic faded into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own heartbeat. This was his moment, the culmination of all his efforts and perseverance. Nothing could stand in his way now, not the nervous flutter in his stomach, nor the whispers of doubt that occasionally surfaced. He reached the crosswalk, waiting for the light to change, his thoughts already in the boardroom, rehearsing the confident, assertive tone he'd use when introducing himself. He could picture the nods of approval, the way his new boss might look at him with respect. The city's noise seemed to dim, and for a moment, it was just him and the future he was about to step into. As the light turned green, Frank stepped off the curb, his mind still lost in the possibilities of what this new job could bring. The morning air was cool against his face, a stark contrast to the warmth that filled his chest with every thought of success. This was it, the beginning of something great, something he had worked so hard to achieve. The future felt like it was right there, just within his grasp. But even as he moved closer to the office, there was a small voice in the back of his mind, a whisper of caution that he tried to ignore. It told him that life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it, that nothing ever went exactly as planned. Frank shook his head, dismissing the thought. Today was his day, and nothing was going to ruin it. The final steps to the office doors were filled with a sense of anticipation. Frank straightened his tie one last time, took a deep breath, and stepped forward, ready to face whatever the day would bring. He was determined to make the most of this opportunity, to prove to himself and to everyone else that he was the right man for the job. And with that, he reached for the door, ready to step into his new life. As Frank crossed the bustling street, his mind was still in the office, envisioning the day ahead. But then, the screech of tires, and the sound of metal crashing against metal jolted him back to reality. He snapped his head toward the noise and saw a car veer off the road, smashing into a tree just a few yards away. Time seemed to slow down as he took in the scene. A crumpled hood, smoke billowing from the engine, and the still figure of the driver slumped over the steering wheel. Without a second thought, Frank's instincts kicked in. The world around him faded as he sprinted toward the wreckage, his new briefcase forgotten on the sidewalk. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, each beat urging him forward. As he reached the car, the acrid smell of burning rubber filled his nostrils, mixing with the thick smoke that was beginning to cloud the air. Frank's hands trembled as he tried to open the driver's door, but it was jammed tight, twisted from the impact. He could see the driver inside, a man, unconscious, with blood trickling down his forehead. Panic surged through Frank, but he pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. He needed to get this man out of the car before it was too late. The smoke was getting thicker, and he could hear the faint hissing sound that warned of an impending fire. Desperation fueled his efforts as he yanked on the door handle with all his strength. It wouldn't budge. Frank glanced around, spotting a metal rod lying near the crash site, debris from the impact. He grabbed it, using it as leverage to pry the door open. With a loud creak, the door finally gave way. Frank wasted no time, reaching in to unbuckle the driver's seatbelt. The man's body was limp and heavy, and Frank struggled to pull him out. His suit, once pristine, was now covered in grime and soot, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting this man to safety. He could feel the heat from the engine as he dragged the driver out, the flames now licking at the edges of the car's interior. His muscles burned with the effort, but Frank didn't stop until they were a safe distance from the wreckage. He laid the man down on the pavement, checking for signs of life. The driver was breathing, but it was shallow and labored. Frank's hands shook as he pulled out his phone to call 911, his voice trembling as he relayed the details to the operator. "There's been an accident. The car's on fire. You need to send help, quick." His words were rushed, driven by the adrenaline pumping through his veins. As he hung up, Frank heard a loud pop, followed by a whoosh as the car burst into flames. The intense heat washed over him, and he instinctively shielded the unconscious driver with his body, pulling him further away from the inferno. The fire roared behind them, and Frank's heart raced, knowing how close they had come to disaster. He looked down at the man he had just saved, feeling a strange mix of fear and relief wash over him. The sound of sirens in the distance brought a flicker of hope. Help was on the way, but until then, it was just Frank and the unconscious man, alone on the pavement. He glanced at his surroundings, realizing for the first time how many people had gathered to watch. Faces stared at him in shock and admiration, but Frank barely noticed. His focus remained on the driver, silently willing him to wake up, to show any sign of recovery. Minutes felt like hours as they waited, the sirens growing louder with each passing second. Frank's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. One moment he was on his way to start a new job, and the next, he was pulling a stranger from the jaws of death. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But this was real, and the weight of it was beginning to settle on his shoulders. Finally, the paramedics arrived, rushing to take over. Frank stepped back, his body trembling with exhaustion. He watched as they worked to stabilize the driver, their calm efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. As they loaded the man into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Frank. "You did good, man. You saved his life." The words barely registered as Frank nodded, his mind still reeling. He stood there for a moment, watching the ambulance speed away, lights flashing and sirens blaring. The crowd began to disperse, leaving Frank alone on the sidewalk. His clothes were ruined, his face streaked with soot, and his hands still shook from the adrenaline. But despite the mess he had become, there was a strange sense of clarity settling in. He had just saved a man's life, something he had never imagined doing on his way to work that morning. As he bent down to pick up his briefcase, Frank realized that his day had taken a turn he could never have predicted. The office seemed like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the gravity of what had just happened. He glanced at his watch, noting the time. He was going to be late, but somehow that didn't seem to matter anymore. With one last look at the charred remains of the car, Frank turned and started walking, his mind racing with the implications of this unexpected detour. As Frank approached the towering glass building of his new office, the excitement of the morning had long faded, replaced by a growing sense of dread. He glanced down at himself, taking in the full extent of the mess he had become. His once pristine suit was torn and smeared with soot, his shirt was wrinkled and stained, and a nasty gash on his forehead had left a streak of dried blood down his temple. The confident, sharp-looking professional he had envisioned was nowhere to be seen. Instead, he looked like a man who had just walked through a battlefield. Frank hesitated at the entrance, feeling the weight of a dozen eyes on him. The sleek, mirrored doors reflected a version of himself that was far from the polished image he had planned to present. He could see people inside, moving briskly through the lobby, each one dressed impeccably in sharp business attire. How could he possibly walk in looking like this? The thought of stepping through those doors, of facing his new colleagues in this state, made his stomach churn. But Frank knew he had no choice. He had come too far to turn back now. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders, trying to summon some of the confidence he had felt earlier that morning. He wiped at his forehead, smearing the blood and soot into a darker, more prominent mark. There was no fixing this. All he could do was hope that his explanation would be enough to excuse his appearance. With a final, steadying breath, Frank pushed open the doors and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the lively hum of the office seemed to come to a halt. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and heads turned to stare at the disheveled man who had just walked in. Frank felt the burn of their gazes, each one a silent question, a mix of curiosity and disbelief. He kept his head high, forcing himself to walk with purpose, though his heart pounded in his chest. Every step felt like a mile, the distance to the elevator stretching out before him. The silence in the lobby was deafening, broken only by the sound of Frank's footsteps on the polished marble floor. He could feel the stairs following him, hear the whispers that began to ripple through the crowd. Who is that? What happened to him? Is he lost? Each murmur only heightened his anxiety, but he refused to let it show. He kept his eyes fixed ahead, focusing on the elevator that would take him to the safety of his new office. Finally, he reached the elevator and pressed the button, praying for the doors to open quickly. But even as he waited, the seconds ticking by like hours, he could feel the tension in the air. The people around him were still staring, their eyes filled with questions that Frank wasn't ready to answer. The polished doors reflected his image back at him, a constant reminder of the disaster this morning had become. His hands clenched around the handle of his briefcase, the only thing that had survived the ordeal unscathed. When the elevator doors finally slid open, Frank stepped inside with a mix of relief and dread. The small, enclosed space felt safer, but he knew it was only a temporary reprieve. He pressed the button for his floor, watching as the doors closed and the lobby disappeared from view. As the elevator ascended, Frank tried to collect his thoughts, to prepare himself for the inevitable questions he would face. He had no idea how he was going to explain this to his boss, to the people who had just hired him. The elevator chimed softly as it reached his floor, and Frank's stomach tightened. This was it. There was no turning back now. As the doors slid open, he was greeted by a corridor that led to the main office. The voices of his new colleagues could be heard from around the corner, the sound of phones ringing, keyboards clicking, and conversations flowing easily. Frank took a deep breath and stepped out, determined to face whatever awaited him. The moment he rounded the corner, the office fell into a stunned silence. Every head turned, and the easy chatter of moments before ceased abruptly. Frank could feel the weight of their stares as he made his way to the front desk, each step feeling heavier than the last. His heart raced, pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to explain what had happened, had to make them understand that this wasn't who he really was. At the front desk, the receptionist looked up, her expression shifting from polite professionalism to wide-eyed surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. Frank swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I'm Frank. Frank Miller," he managed, his voice cracking. "It's my first day." The receptionist blinked, clearly taken aback. She glanced down at her schedule, then back up at Frank, as if trying to reconcile the man before her with the name on her list. Before she could respond, a door to the side of the office opened, and a tall, imposing figure stepped out. Frank recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Thompson, the man who had interviewed him, the one who had offered him this job. The sight of his new boss made Frank's heart sink even further. Mr. Thompson's sharp gaze locked onto Frank, taking in the full extent of his disheveled appearance. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with tension. Frank braced himself for the worst. He could almost see the disappointment in Mr. Thompson's eyes, the unspoken judgment that this was not the man he had hired. Frank opened his mouth to explain, to somehow justify the state he was in, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced, searching for the right thing to say, but all he could do was stand there, feeling like a man on trial. As Frank stood in front of Mr. Thompson, the silence between them felt unbearable. He could feel his pulse throbbing in his temples, a constant reminder of the disaster this day had become. Every second that passed without a word only heightened his anxiety. Frank was prepared for the worst, prepared to hear that his first day was also his last. He took a deep breath, ready to launch into an explanation, but before he could speak, Mr. Thompson finally broke the silence. The stern look on Mr. Thompson's face softened, his sharp eyes losing some of their edge as they scanned Frank from head to toe. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Frank swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat as he tried to explain. "There was an accident," he began, his voice shaky. "On my way here, I saw a car crash, and Frank's explanation faltered as the memory of the event flooded back, the smell of smoke and the sound of crunching metal still fresh in his mind. Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow, his interest clearly piqued. "You were in an accident?" he asked, the hint of concern evident in his tone. Frank shook his head quickly, clarifying, "No, I wasn't in it, but I saw it happen. The car hit a tree, and there was smoke. I couldn't just walk away." His words tumbled out in a rush as he recounted the events, from prying the car door open to pulling the unconscious driver to safety. As he spoke, he could see the expression on Mr. Thompson's face changing, the initial shock giving way to something else, something that looked almost like admiration. When Frank finished, there was a moment of silence, as if Mr. Thompson was processing everything he had just heard. Frank braced himself for whatever came next, half expecting to be told that, despite his good intentions, he was no longer welcome at the company. But instead, Mr. Thompson surprised him. "So, you saved someone's life this morning?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost reverent. Frank nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. "I guess I did," he admitted, the reality of what he had done only now beginning to sink in. To Frank's astonishment, Mr. Thompson's stern expression softened further, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Well, that's not something you hear every day," he said, the hint of pride in his voice unmistakable. Frank blinked in surprise, the tension that had been coiled tightly in his chest beginning to unravel. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had prepared himself for disappointment, for judgment, but not for this unexpected recognition of his actions. Mr. Thompson stepped closer, his demeanor more relaxed now, as if the weight of the situation had shifted. "Frank," he said, his tone more personal, "you did the right thing. Not many people would have the courage to do what you did today. I'm impressed." The words hit Frank like a wave of relief, washing away the fears that had been gnawing at him, since he walked through the office doors. He had been so focused on the mess he had made of his appearance, on the potential repercussions of being late, that he hadn't considered that his actions might actually be seen as heroic. Frank let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, his shoulders relaxing as the tension melted away. Mr. Thompson's eyes softened as he continued, "Look, I understand this isn't how you planned your first day to go, but what you did out there, that's something to be proud of." Frank could feel a warmth spreading through his chest, a mixture of pride and relief. He had been so worried about making a bad impression that he hadn't allowed himself to see the bigger picture. Now, hearing these words from his new boss, he realized that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay after all. Mr. Thompson gestured for Frank to follow him into his office, his usual brisk pace tempered by a newfound respect. Frank followed, still processing the shift in the day's events. As they entered the office, Mr. Thompson motioned for him to take a seat. "We'll deal with the formalities later," he said, his tone more relaxed now. "Right now, you need to get that cut looked at." Frank nodded, still dazed by the unexpected turn of events. He touched his forehead, wincing slightly as he felt the dried blood under his fingertips. Mr. Thompson picked up the phone on his desk, dialing a number with quick, practiced movements. "I'm going to have someone from HR take you to the clinic," he said, looking at Frank with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You've had quite a morning, and I think you deserve a break." Frank could only nod, still trying to wrap his mind around everything that had happened. The fear and anxiety that had gripped him just moments ago had been replaced by a strange sense of calm. A calm that came from knowing he had done something good, something that mattered. As they waited for the HR representative to arrive, Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his usual stoic expression replaced by one of curiosity. "So, Frank," he said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips, "tell me more about what happened out there. I'm sure there's quite a story behind those torn clothes." Frank hesitated for a moment, then began to recount the events in more detail, his words coming easier now that the initial tension had passed. As he spoke, he could see the genuine interest in Mr. Thompson's eyes, a far cry from the stern gaze that had greeted him earlier. By the time Frank finished his story, the HR representative had arrived, a kind-looking woman who introduced herself as Linda. She smiled warmly at Frank, clearly already briefed on the situation. "I'll take you to the clinic," she said gently, guiding him out of the office. As they left, Mr. Thompson called out after them, "Take care of yourself, Frank. We'll sort everything else out later." Frank turned back to see his boss giving him an encouraging nod, and for the first time that day, he felt a genuine smile spread across his face. As Linda guided Frank down the hallway toward the clinic, he couldn't help but replay the morning's events over in his mind. Everything had happened so fast, and now that the adrenaline was wearing off, the reality of what he had done began to sink in. His hands were still trembling slightly, and his thoughts were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had saved a life, but at the cost of what he had hoped would be the perfect start to his new job. Yet, as he walked beside Linda, he couldn't shake the feeling that this experience was more significant than just a disruption to his day. The clinic was a small, quiet space tucked away in a corner of the building. Linda led Frank inside, where a nurse greeted them with a calm, reassuring smile. "Mr. Miller, right? Let's take a look at that cut," she said, her voice soothing as she gestured for him to sit down. Frank nodded, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over him as he sank into the chair. The nurse examined the gash on his forehead, her gentle touch a stark contrast to the chaos he had faced earlier. "You're lucky," she remarked. "This looks worse than it is. We'll clean it up and get you a bandage." As the nurse worked, Linda sat nearby, her expression one of quiet concern. Frank appreciated her presence, even though they had only just met. It was comforting to know that someone cared, that he wasn't just another employee lost in the shuffle of a busy office. "You've had quite a day," Linda said softly, her eyes meeting his. Frank nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I didn't expect any of this," he admitted, his voice tinged with disbelief. I was just trying to get to work. Linda offered him a sympathetic smile. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it, she replied, her tone warm and understanding. Frank appreciated her kindness, even as he struggled to process everything that had happened. The nurse finished cleaning his wound and carefully placed a bandage over it, her movements efficient yet gentle. There you go, she said with a smile. All patched up. You'll be fine, but take it easy for the rest of the day, okay? Frank nodded again, but his mind was already racing ahead. He couldn't just go home now, not after everything that had happened. He needed to get back to the office, to prove that he could handle whatever came his way. But as he stood up, ready to thank the nurse and head back to his desk, Linda placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. Frank, she said gently, I think you should go home for the day. You've been through a lot, and it's important to take care of yourself. Frank opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. Linda was right. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The events of the morning had taken a toll on him, and the idea of jumping right back into work felt overwhelming. But at the same time, he didn't want to let anyone down, especially not on his first day. He struggled with the decision, the desire to push through clashing with the need to rest and recover. Before he could make up his mind, there was a knock on the door, and Mr. Thompson stepped into the clinic. His presence filled the small room, his usual authoritative demeanor softened by a genuine concern. How are you holding up, Frank? He asked, his voice gentle but firm. Frank looked up, surprised to see his boss again so soon. I'm okay, he replied, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. Mr. Thompson nodded, as if he understood the internal conflict Frank was facing. I know you're eager to get back to work, Mr. Thompson continued, his gaze steady. But Linda's right. You've had a rough morning, and I don't want you pushing yourself too hard. We can handle things here for the day. Go home, get some rest, and come back tomorrow when you're feeling better. Frank wanted to argue, to insist that he was fine, but the look in Mr. Thompson's eyes told him that this was more than just a suggestion. It was an order. Reluctantly, Frank nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet but sincere. Mr. Thompson smiled, a rare expression of warmth that made Frank feel more at ease. You did something incredible today, Frank, he said, his tone filled with admiration. You've already proven yourself in ways that most people never will. Now, take the time you need to recover. We'll see you tomorrow. As Frank gathered his things and prepared to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This wasn't how he had imagined his first day going, and the thought of leaving early felt like a failure. But as he stepped out of the clinic, the fresh air hitting his face, he realized that maybe this day had been about more than just starting a new job. Maybe it was about something deeper, about realizing that life's priorities can shift in an instant, and that sometimes taking care of yourself is just as important as proving your worth. The walk home was a quiet one, the city's noise fading into the background as Frank's thoughts took over. He replayed the events of the day, the adrenaline, the fear, the relief, all mixing together into a blur of emotions. It was a lot to process, and he knew it would take time to fully understand the impact of what had happened. But as he reached his front door, a sense of clarity began to emerge. Today had been a wake-up call, a reminder that life is unpredictable, and that sometimes the best thing you can do is roll with the punches and take care of yourself along the way. As he entered his home, the familiar comfort of his surroundings helped to ground him. He set his briefcase down and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day begin to lift. Frank knew he had made the right decision in going home, even if it felt strange to leave work so early on his first day. He had faced a challenge he never could have anticipated, and he had come through it stronger. Now, it was time to rest, to recharge, and to be ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The next few days passed in a blur for Frank. He had taken Mr. Thompson's advice and spent the remainder of that first day at home, allowing himself time to rest and recover. But the events of that morning still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of how quickly life could change. Each time he closed his eyes, He could see the wreckage, smell the smoke, feel the heat of the flames against his skin. It was an experience that had marked him, not just physically, but emotionally as well. When he finally returned to the office, Frank was greeted with a mix of curiosity and admiration. News of his actions had spread through the company, and his colleagues seemed to look at him with a newfound respect. The whispers that had followed him on his first day were now replaced with words of praise and gratitude. It was a strange feeling, being recognized not for his work, but for something so unexpected. Frank wasn't sure how to process it, but he knew that he couldn't let it distract him from the job he was there to do. As he settled back into his routine, Frank found himself more determined than ever to prove his worth in the office. The memory of that first day had left him with a sense of purpose, a desire to show that he was more than just a hero in a torn suit. He threw himself into his work with renewed energy, eager to make up for the time he had lost. His colleagues were welcoming, and Mr. Thompson was more approachable than Frank had anticipated. It seemed that the events of that first day had created a bond between them, one that Frank hadn't expected. But even as he focused on his tasks, there was a part of Frank that couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just the way people looked at him. It was something deeper, something that went beyond the office. He had faced a situation that had tested him in ways he hadn't imagined, and it had left him questioning his priorities, his goals, and even his place in the world. The promotion he had once dreamed of seemed less important now, overshadowed by the reality of what he had experienced. Then, one morning, just as Frank was settling into his work, he received an unexpected call from Mr. Thompson's office. The voice on the other end was polite but firm, asking Frank to come to the conference room for an impromptu meeting. Frank's heart skipped a beat. Had he done something wrong? Was there a problem with his work? His mind raced with possibilities as he made his way to the meeting, each step filled with uncertainty. The memory of his first day still haunted him, and he couldn't help but wonder if it was about to come back to haunt him in a different way. When Frank entered the conference room, he was surprised to see not just Mr. Thompson, but several other senior executives seated around the table. The atmosphere was tense, and Frank felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. He had prepared himself for a normal day at work, not for a meeting with the company's top brass. As he took a seat, he tried to keep his nerves in check, but it was clear that something big was about to happen. Mr. Thompson was the first to speak, his voice calm and measured. "Frank, I wanted to bring you in today to discuss something important," he began, his eyes steady on Frank's. "As you know, we've all heard about what happened on your first day. Your actions were nothing short of heroic, and they've had a significant impact on everyone here." Frank listened, his anxiety slowly giving way to confusion. This wasn't what he had expected. He had prepared for a reprimand, not for praise. But as Mr. Thompson continued, it became clear that this meeting was about more than just recognition. "We've been discussing your role here at the company," he said, his tone growing more serious. "And we believe that someone with your quick thinking, your courage under pressure, and your ability to act decisively in a crisis deserves to be recognized in a more meaningful way." Frank blinked in surprise, the implications of Mr. Thompson's words beginning to sink in. The senior executives nodded in agreement, their expressions supportive. "Frank," Mr. Thompson continued, "we'd like to offer you a promotion. Effective immediately, you'll be stepping into a new role, one that reflects the qualities you demonstrated on your first day." Frank's mind raced as he tried to process the news. A promotion? So soon? He had only just started, and now they were asking him to take on more responsibility, to step into a role he hadn't even considered. For a moment, Frank was speechless. He had dreamed of this, yes, but not like this, not so quickly, not under these circumstances. He looked around the room, seeing the sincerity in the faces of the executives, and realized that this was real. They weren't just offering him a promotion. They were recognizing him for something that went beyond his job description, something that spoke to his character, his instincts, his ability to handle the unexpected. I don't know what to say," Frank finally managed, his voice filled with emotion. Mr. Thompson smiled, his expression warm and encouraging. "You don't have to say anything right now," he replied. "Just know that we believe in you, Frank. You've already proven yourself in ways that most people never do. This promotion is our way of acknowledging that and giving you the opportunity to grow even further." Frank nodded, still trying to wrap his mind around the sudden turn of events. As the meeting came to a close, Frank was handed a folder outlining the details of his new role. He held it in his hands, feeling the weight of the responsibility it represented. This was it, the moment he had been working toward, the culmination of all his efforts. But as he left the conference room, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. Frank couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. He was proud, yes, but also overwhelmed by the realization that his life had just taken another unexpected turn. As Frank stepped into his new office, a wave of emotions washed over him. The space was larger, more prestigious, and the view from the window was nothing short of breathtaking. He could see the city sprawled out before him, a sea of buildings and people, all moving in their own rhythm. It was a far cry from the modest desk he had occupied just a few days ago. Everything about this office screamed success, achievement, and the recognition he had always dreamed of. But as he stood there, taking it all in, Frank realized that this new chapter in his life was about more than just a change in scenery. The weight of the promotion still hung heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just a new title or a bigger office. It was a responsibility, a commitment to live up to the expectations that had been placed upon him. Frank knew that he had earned this position, not through years of climbing the corporate ladder, but through a single, life-altering act. And while he was proud of what he had done, there was a part of him that still struggled to reconcile the hero he had become with the man he saw in the mirror every morning. As he settled into his new role, Frank found himself reflecting on the events that had led him here. The fear and anxiety of his first day seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a sense of belonging and purpose that he hadn't felt in years. The office, once a daunting and intimidating place, now felt like home. His colleagues, who had once been strangers, now greeted him with warmth and respect. It was a transformation that Frank hadn't anticipated, but one that he welcomed with open arms. But even as he embraced this new start, Frank couldn't help but feel a twinge of uncertainty. He had spent so long chasing success, so long striving to prove himself, that he wasn't sure how to handle the reality of actually achieving it. The promotion was everything he had ever wanted, but it had come at a time and in a way that he had never imagined. It was a reminder that life had its own plans, that the path to success was rarely straightforward, and that sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected experiences. Frank's first few weeks in his new role were a whirlwind of meetings, projects, and new responsibilities. He threw himself into his work with the same determination and focus that had carried him through the early days of his career. But now, there was something different, a deeper sense of purpose that went beyond the day-to-day tasks. Frank knew that he had been given a unique opportunity, one that many people never got, and he was determined to make the most of it. As he settled into the rhythm of his new job, Frank began to notice subtle changes in himself. He was more confident, more assertive, more willing to take risks. The fear that had once held him back was slowly fading, replaced by a quiet but steady belief in his own abilities. He found himself speaking up in meetings, offering ideas and solutions without the hesitation that had once plagued him. And as he did, he could see the respect in his colleagues' eyes, the recognition that he was no longer just another employee, but a leader in his own right. But perhaps the most significant change was the way Frank approached his work. Where once he had been focused solely on climbing the ladder, on proving his worth through titles and promotions, now he found himself driven by something deeper. A desire to make a difference, to leave a lasting impact on the company and the people he worked with. He saw his role not just as a job, but as a responsibility to use his position for good, to lead by example, and to inspire others to do the same. One afternoon, as Frank was wrapping up a meeting, he received an unexpected visitor, Mr. Thompson. The older man had always been a figure of authority, someone Frank had respected and admired from a distance. But now, as they stood in Frank's office, there was a sense of camaraderie between them, a mutual understanding that went beyond their professional relationship. "How are you settling in?" Mr. Thompson asked, his tone warm and genuine. Frank smiled, the tension that had once gripped him now a distant memory. "I'm doing well," he replied, his voice steady. "It's been a big change, but I'm grateful for the opportunity." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes reflecting the same pride that Frank felt. "You've earned it," he said simply, "and I have no doubt that you'll continue to make us proud." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Frank couldn't ignore. They were a reminder of how far he had come, and of the responsibility that came with his new position. As Mr. Thompson left the office, Frank took a moment to reflect on his journey. The fear and anxiety that had once dominated his thoughts were gone, replaced by a sense of peace and contentment. He had faced challenges, both expected and unexpected, and had come through them stronger, more resilient, more confident in who he was and what he could achieve. And as he looked out over the city from his office window, Frank realized that this new start wasn't just about his career. It was about his life and the person he had become. In the quiet moments of the day, when the hustle and bustle of the office faded into the background, Frank allowed himself to think about the future. He knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome, but he also knew that he was ready for them. The man who had walked into this office on his first day was not the same man who stood here now. He had grown, evolved, and in doing so, had found a sense of purpose that went beyond the walls of the office. Frank smiled to himself, feeling a sense of calm that had eluded him for so long. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing that he had the strength, the courage, and the resilience to face it head-on. This was his new start, and he was determined to make the most of it. As the day drew to a close, Frank sat at his desk, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across his office. The hum of the city outside was a gentle reminder of the world that continued to move forward, even as he took a moment to pause and reflect. It had been a whirlwind of a journey, from the unexpected detour on his first day to the new responsibilities he now shouldered. And as he looked back on everything that had happened, Frank couldn't help but marvel at the way life had unfolded in ways he never could have anticipated. He had always been someone who valued control, who planned meticulously, and who sought to predict every possible outcome. But the events of these past few weeks had shown him that life had its own plans that often didn't align with his own. The car accident, the promotion, the new challenges, all of it had come out of nowhere, upending the carefully laid path he had set for himself. And yet, despite the chaos, Frank had found a sense of peace in the uncertainty. It was a realization that had been slow to dawn on him, but now, as he sat in the quiet of his office, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Life was unpredictable, full of twists and turns that could either break you or shape you into something stronger. Frank had chosen to embrace the latter, to see the unexpected not as a threat, but as an opportunity for growth. It was a shift in perspective that had transformed not just his career, but his entire outlook on life. Frank's thoughts drifted back to the moment he had pulled the driver from the wreckage. At the time, it had been an act of instinct, driven by adrenaline and a deep-seated need to help. But now, looking back, he realized that it had been more than that. It had been a catalyst, a moment that had set off a chain of events leading him to where he was now. It was as if life had been testing him, pushing him to step outside of his comfort zone and confront the unknown head-on. And in doing so, Frank had discovered something profound about himself. He had learned that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined, that he could face challenges with courage and resilience, and that he could find strength in the most unlikely places. It was a lesson that had changed him, making him more open to the surprises that life had to offer. Frank knew now that the future was uncertain, but he also knew that he was ready for whatever it might bring. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, golden light, Frank felt a sense of closure. The fear and anxiety that had once dominated his thoughts were gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing he had faced the unexpected and emerged stronger. This new chapter in his life was just beginning, and while he didn't know what lay ahead, he was no longer afraid of the unknown. Instead, he welcomed it, knowing that it was all part of the journey. Frank stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. The streets were alive with the hustle and bustle of people going about their lives, each one facing their own challenges, their own moments of uncertainty. It was a reminder that he wasn't alone, that everyone was on their own path, navigating the twists and turns that life threw at them. And in that, Frank found a sense of connection, a reminder that the unexpected was something to be embraced, not feared. As he turned away from the window, Frank felt a sense of calm settle over him. He was ready to face the future with an open heart and an open mind, knowing that whatever came next, he had the strength to handle it. Life had a way of surprising you, of taking you down paths you never expected, but it was in those moments of uncertainty that true growth happened. And with that thought, Frank knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As Frank prepared to leave for the day, he took one last look around his office, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. This was just the beginning, and he was eager to see where this new journey would take him. But for now, he was content to take it one day at a time, embracing the unexpected with courage and grace. And as he stepped out into the evening air, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that whatever came next, he was ready. If Frank's journey resonated with you, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story. Share your thoughts in the comments. How have unexpected moments shaped your life? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life every day. Plus, if you'd like to contribute to our channel, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the pinned comment. Your generosity allows us to continue sharing inspiring stories. Thanks for being part of our community, and we'll see you in the next video.